Hello, this is Virtualis the Chess Noob, learning and having fun with chess. Today I played a game against the Sicilian Defense. My usual approach against the Sicilian is to play the Grand Prix attack, which worked very well for me in a game from my first tournament a few weeks ago. In this game, I was gradually losing ground until the latter part of the middle game, where the game became wild and chaotic. Please enjoy! Let's start with a quick review. So this is chess.com's algorithm, and as you can see, fairly smooth game initially, and I was gradually losing my advantage, or the opponent was gradually gaining an advantage over the course of the game. And then suddenly in the later part of the middle game, it gets completely up and down. So a wild, chaotic game. And somehow I actually managed to win this game despite playing a lower level of accuracy than my opponent. And overall, this was a low accuracy game. So 58% for myself, about 61% from my opponent. The opponent made some better moves than me in terms of number. We each had fair number of inaccuracies, mistakes, but my opponent made some blunders, and that probably made all the difference towards the end. Let's move on now to the analysis. So in this game, I played with the white pieces, my opponent with black. I start with e4, opponent plays c5, the beginning of the Sicilian defense. So against the Sicilian, I played the Grand Prix attack, so knight c3, opponent played d6, and now f4, the beginning of the Grand Prix attack. Opponent plays a6, I play bishop c4, opponent plays e6, so setting up the pawns, and at this point we're both very equal in the opening. I play d3, opponent develops the other bishop, bishop e7, and I now develop my other knight to f3. They play knight f6, I short castles, and now they try a queenside expansion b5. So at the moment, we're both remaining very equal towards the end of the opening. Now, obviously, I need to do something about that bishop, so I pull the bishop back to b3. Opponent plays queen c7, which was apparently an inaccuracy. Here I felt that I needed to give some breathing room for my queen. So I played a4, which was apparently a relative mistake. Stockfish recommends striking out into the center right away. And I suppose that makes a bit of sense. I've castled, the opponent hasn't castled yet, so trying to break open the center. Opponent plays b4, attacking my knight, and so I bring the knight back to knight e2. They short castles, and again, we are effectively equal in this position. I play knight g5. Stockfish thinks that that would have been a better move. And the reason is they can respond very simply with h6, and I'm forced to bring the knight basically back to the square, so losing some tempo. Opponent plays bishop b7, putting now extra pressure on my pawn on e4. So I just moved that pawn out of the way to e5. I thought I had an opportunity to crack open the center here. Stockfish disagrees. So e5 they reckon was a mistake. Captures, and opponent now makes a mistake. So knight d5, it would have been better for them to retreat. Again, putting extra pressure then on that pawn. I play c4, thinking that I had an attack on that knight. They shoot the knight over to knight b6. I push a5, having an attack on the knight again, and the knight now goes to d7. So this transformation was apparently all good for black, and black playing the Sicilian is playing a more I suppose, conservative and sort of closed arrangement. So this actually helped with black. I now develop bishop to f4, so feeling that I do need to give an extra defender to that pawn. The opponent plays knight c6, again with an extra attacker. Here I decided to push d4 again. This was a mistake. My logic here was that this pawn provided an extra defense, and if they chose to capture, I could potentially capture back in this fashion. At the end of the transformation, however, black apparently is ahead. And I am just a little bit down on material. Now, this was my first bluff. So clearly here, I'm giving an attack on the queen. One of the things I didn't like was that the bishop and the queen had a battery potentially facing the g2 pawn. That's potentially mate. There is a risk with me needing to provide defense to that pawn, and that effectively sort of locks that rook to in and around this position. So I really didn't like the bishop and queen being on a battery. So here I was threatening the queen. Now, obviously, this was a bluff because the opponent could simply capture that pawn, which would now be hanging with a threat there as well. I was banking on the possibility that they might not see that move. That they simply might not see that move, and it kind of worked. So rather than capturing the pawn, which was good for black, they pulled their queen back onto their back rank. So I felt that that was probably an improvement for me. Here, I now now that the queen and bishop are no longer in a battery facing the g2 pawn, allows me to just move the rook out of the way, and Stockfish thought that this was the best move. Now facing the king, and the goal of the Grand Prix attack, of course, is to try to bring all the pieces and coordinated pieces to attack the king. With that pawn now pinned to the king, there is the possibility for the bishop to now attack to basically to capture some material. So this is looking good for me. And the opponent is potentially forced to respond to that unless they can create some new threats. Now again, they could have just captured that, but this looks a bit scary. So they moved their bishop to f6 to provide a defense of that pawn. That doesn't stop me from just capturing that pawn, stripping away some of the defenses of the king. Now the king makes this move to potentially, threaten that bishop. Now at this point, I didn't see a very, very winning line. So I chose to pull the bishop back, and you can see that's a missed win from +9 back to slightly favoring black again. But I have regained a lot of the advantage. Now what I should have done is this move queen h5. And the reason for that, let's drop to self-analysis, is that if I move the queen here, opponent decides to, oh look, might as well just capture what looks like a hanging bishop. I now have check. This basically now forces the opponent to move their king out of the way. Now this file is protected by the rook. Now the opponent could try to block with the bishop, but that just delays a turn, doesn't really achieve very much. Effectively, king is forced to move back, and then that would be checkmate. So I didn't see that sequence, I didn't see that line, but this is part of the power, I think, of the Grand Prix attack. You get all these sneaky, strong attacks on the king's side. But I didn't see that line in the actual game. And so instead, now what happened here? Here we are. So back to the position. I pulled my bishop back to d2. So definitely not as good, obviously, but the position is getting fairly equal considering I was substantially down before. Opponent captures what looks like a hanging pawn. However, I now saw here an opportunity. So, bring the bishop here with check. The opponent moves to the best position. However, I now have the opportunity to play queen h5, and this is a potential mate threat. So if I move the queen, so this is a mate in one threat, the opponent must address this, so I'm not too worried about the rook at the moment. They thought a while and they made the best move with f5. So this blocks that mate in one threat. At the same time, I'm not able to capture that pawn given it's defended by the other pawn, which is then also defended by the queen as well. So that was a very good move for black. I thought the best move here was to just bring my other rook into the game. So I played f1. I wasn't entirely sure the best way to progress here, but definitely need to move it out of a1 given it was under attack. Opponent now does a very curious blunder. I'm not entirely sure why they made that move. They spent some time, I think, thinking of that move. I was wondering whether or not this was a trap of some sort. But I decided, look, no reason not to capture, and I think it was actually just a blunder. Maybe there was a mouse slip there, not too sure. The opponent now captures that hanging pawn, which had been hanging for some while, with the queen. And at this point, I thought, let's make another mate in one threat. So lining up the queen here. Now, this was a blunder because the opponent now has a very powerful potential move, which is queen to d4, which forks the rook and the king. But I was wondering whether or not the opponent wouldn't see that and maybe won't see that mate in one threat, thinking that they sort of addressed this other mate in one threat and might get greedy and just capture my bishop. And that's exactly what they did. And of course, then checkmate. So great game. Thank you to the opponent. GG. The overall strategy of the Grand Prix attack is to set up an overwhelming attack on the opponent's king, especially if they castle kingside. I played very inaccurately in this game, but the series of checkmate threats eventually overwhelmed my opponent, who made a fatal error. In this game, I also made some calculated risks, effectively pushing an aggressive line, knowing that my opponent could call my bluff. This psychological brinksmanship is partly what makes chess so fun at the beginner intermediate level. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.